On the 11th of August, 1840, a woman inside a Philadelphia prison was put in a dark cell on bread and water. The warden wrote the reason in his journal: disorderly conduct, shouting, and disturbing the other prisoners. He did not write her name. He wrote her number, 1050. The building had been designed so that no prisoner could hear another. This was the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia in 1840. The institution wrote almost all of it down. What a cell measured, what came through the feeding hole, what one prisoner trained a rat to carry, what fell through the round skylight 16 feet overhead, which the prison called the dead eye, and what 3 words were written beside a man's name after somebody had come to see him. The warden's journal held the rest. In another cell block that same week, women serving the same kinds of sentences cooked the prison's meals together and washed its laundry. Beside them, men went years without seeing another prisoner's face. A prisoner came up the hill in the custody of a county sheriff and in through the only opening in half a mile of wall. The first thing that happened to him was that he was taken out of his own clothes. His hair was closely trimmed. He was washed and dressed in the uniform of the prison. Then a hood was drawn over his head, and he was led through the building. The hood came off inside the cell. Only then was he questioned about his former life and told the rules. Only then was he written into the admission book. A name, an age, a trade, a birthplace, an offense, and a sentence. Then a few lines of the moral instructor's private judgment on him. He was given a number, and the number replaced the name, so that no convict could ever recognize another after release. Most of the men were in their 20s and 30s. The common offenses were robbery and burglary. Horse theft, forgery, and murder brought in the rest. Sentences ran about 2 years, and few ran past 8. There were no life sentences at Eastern State. Men condemned to die were sent elsewhere. A small number of women arrived under the same kinds of sentences for the same kinds of crimes. The prison books do not match the state around them. In the 1840 census, black Pennsylvanians were roughly 3% of the population. Inside these walls, they were roughly a third. The inspectors understood exactly what the arrival was for. In July 1831, they wrote to the county courts asking the sheriffs to stop letting prisoners get drunk on the road. A man who arrived staggering did not receive the impression the building had been built to make. The cell was about 8 feet by 12. It had a wooden floor and a high arched ceiling, closer to a chapel than a dungeon. There was a bed and a workbench. There was a cast iron toilet flushed with water once a day and a faucet. For most prisoners, the Bible was the only thing they were permitted to own. 20 inches of masonry stood between one prisoner and the next. The cells were heated by hot water pipes running from a furnace in a small shed at the end of the block. In 1840, the White House had no running water and burned coal in open grates. Men who had never had either now had both, alone, behind a locked door. At the back of the cell was a low door into a private yard, slightly larger than the cell itself and walled 10 feet high. It was open to the sky. That yard door was the only way in. There was no door onto the corridor at all. Meals and messages passed through a small opening in the front wall called the feeding hole. Above, 16 feet up, was a round skylight. The prison called it the dead eye. It was the only daylight that reached the cell, and the only thing in the room that changed. Reformers said the light stood for the eye of God, watching a man who could not be watched by anyone else. At night, 20 inches of stone did not do what the architect had promised. Men tapped. Men shouted in their cells and were heard. Nothing in the building announced the morning. There was no clock and no bell that the record preserves. The first event of the day was the feeding hole opening. Food came 3 times a day and was eaten alone. Overseers were required to look in on every prisoner 3 times a day. The warden was legally required to visit every prisoner, every day. For most men, that was the entire quantity of human contact available. Work filled the rest. Prisoners made shoes, caned chairs, and wove cloth and dyed it. All of it was done inside the cell, all day, for years at a time. Twice a day, a man was let into his yard for half an hour. The schedule was arranged so that neighboring cells were never opened together. Once every 2 or 3 weeks, he was taken out to bathe, hooded going and hooded coming back. On Sundays, a minister preached in the corridor. The cells stayed shut. The sermon arrived as a voice through a hole in the wall. Women were not given a trade in a cell. They were assigned the laundry and the kitchens, which meant they moved through the building. Nothing was posted anywhere. The hours were counted by the light from the dead eye crossing the floor and climbing the far wall. The food cart had leather pads on its wheels so that no one could hear it coming. What it carried had been measured out in a kitchen worked by prisoners. Breakfast was coffee or boiled cocoa shells sweetened with molasses. It came with rye bread. Dinner was the main meal: broiled salted beef or soup boiled from an ox head, potatoes with either. Supper was Indian mush, which is cornmeal and water, with molasses poured over it. The same rotation, the same room. Alone for the length of the sentence. When a man broke a rule, the diet was reduced. In the worst cases, it came down to bread and water, exactly as it did for prisoner 1050 in August 1840. The prison's own medical logbooks begin that year. The earliest volume runs from 1840 to 1843. It gives daily tallies of patients and their diseases, with a separate count kept for African American prisoners. Tuberculosis was the single greatest cause of death inside these walls. It appears in the returns as consumption and as scrofula, the tubercular swelling of the neck and throat that a physician could see from the doorway. The hot water pipes that heated the cells ran from one cell into the next. One prisoner tamed a rat. The animal could cross between cells where a man could not, and it was used to carry messages. Men tapped on the water pipes, on the floors and on the walls. They shouted. They threw notes over the walls of the exercise yards. On the 27th of January 1835, the warden recorded finding 6 prisoners who had been talking through holes they had made alongside their hot water pipes. In 1834, the sewer pipes carried enough conversation for the convicts to plan a general insurrection. The prison knew. The overseers wore wool socks pulled over their shoes. The pipes were kept full of water and routed out into the corridor so that tapping could be heard from outside the cell. In the summer of 1838, the The sewer pipes of one entire cell block were rebuilt to stop men talking through them. The same work was planned for the other blocks in 1839. The most famous silent prison on Earth spent the years around 1840 replumbing itself because its prisoners would not stop speaking to each other. They planned escapes as well. In January 1835, the warden received a note from one prisoner informing on 3 others. Ropes made from bed sheets were found in 2 cells. One man in cell block 6 was disciplined for talking to a woman prisoner through his skylight. A prisoner named James Morton left a line about what the cell did to a mind. In the gloomy solitude of a sullen cell, he said, "There is but one step between the prisoner and insanity." In the warden's punishment journal, entries for talking with another prisoner outnumber every other offense. The consequences were set out in 1835, when the Pennsylvania Legislature made the keepers of Eastern State testify under oath. The first punishment was the dark cell. It was an ordinary cell with the light shut out, where a prisoner was locked in with a blanket, and in some cases without one. The second was the reduced diet. Both were used constantly, and both were considered mild. Beyond that were the instruments. The straitjacket was 3 thicknesses of sackcloth, laced tight up the back like a corset. The tranquilizing chair was a heavy plank chair built to Benjamin Rush's specifications. It had straps at the arms and body and ankles, and no board for the feet, so that a man strapped into it could not move any part of himself. There was a shower bath. In one case, 13 buckets of cold water were poured over a prisoner in cold weather because he had fouled his cell. And there was an iron gag, resembling the stiff bit of a blind bridle, with chains that fastened behind the neck. None of this appears in the annual reports sent to the legislature. The reports described a system of privations rather than punishments. Almost none of it would be known at all, except that one prisoner died wearing the gag. Matthias McElwee was 44 years old, from Lancaster County, serving a 12-year sentence. He had been caught more than once getting the men next to him talking. On the 27th of June, 1833, the warden ordered the gag put on him. It was fitted around 8 o'clock. About an hour later, he was found warm, with no pulse. The physician performed a post-mortem the next day and certified apoplexy. When the legislature demanded the gag itself, the warden reported that a diligent search had failed to find it. He produced a copy made to order. His name survives because he died, and because a committee was compelled to write it down. Most prisoners at Eastern State left nothing of their own at all. The men who fitted that gag finished their shift and went home to houses inside the wall. The warden lived in the castle-like administration building at the front of the prison, with his household around him. Overseers walked the corridors in wool socks. They looked into every cell 3 times a day, and they went out through the gate at the end of it. The women were prisoners under the same sentences as the men, and they lived a different life inside the same walls. By 1836, there were 19 of them, moved that year to the upper gallery of cell block 7 under a hired matron. They slept in cells. They did not work alone in them. They cooked the meals for the institution, and they washed its clothes. That work was done on the ground floor, in company, within sight and sound of each other. The rule of silence applied to them and was enforced on them. That is what the entry for the 11th of August, 1840 records. Then there were the people who came to look. Through the 1830s and 1840s, Eastern State drew more sightseers than Independence Hall. Officials arrived from Britain, France, and Russia. They walked the corridors, looked into the cells, and left through the only opening in half a mile of wall. They ate dinner in the city that evening and slept in Philadelphia hotels. What they had seen was carried home and built again. Roughly 300 prisons on 5 continents were eventually raised on the plan of this building. Prisoner, keeper, and tourist all breathed the same air, and that was deliberate. The architect had been told that disease came from bad air, and the entire building was engineered around it. The hilltop site, the skylights, the private yards, and the ventilation were all there to keep men alive in isolation. Air was not the only thing that reached every level of the place. The other was the record. The moral instructor's name was Thomas Larcombe. He entered every cell, regardless of sex or race or sentence. He spent 6 to 8 hours a day visiting the sick and instructing the ignorant. Then he went back to his book and wrote a verdict on each of them. Hope. Some hope. No hope. Of the prisoners aged 21 and over, 45% were marked as having no hope at all. This was an institution built to manufacture penitence, which kept a written ledger of whether it had worked. The Joint Committee heard all the testimony and reported in March 1835. The majority acquitted the warden and his staff of everything. The minority report, written by Thomas McElwee, said the punishment had been unlawful and that McComsey had therefore been murdered. What changed was the gag. It was discontinued. What did not change was anything else. The dark cell stayed. The reduced diet stayed. The system itself was never touched. Samuel Wood resigned as warden in 1840, 5 years after the investigation that cleared him. Separate confinement at Eastern State was not abandoned until 1913, and by then it had already collapsed on its own, with half the prisoners sharing cells. None of that had happened yet in 1840. In 1840, the woman came out of the dark cell and went back to the ordinary day. In the warden's journal, she was still 1,050. The laundry and the kitchen. The hooded walk to the bath every second or third week. The Bible, the workbench, the cast-iron toilet flushed once a day. The 20 inches of stone, the padded wheels of the cart, and the dead eye 16 feet overhead. Somewhere below her, men were tapping on the pipes. Outside, on the road up the hill, visitors were arriving to see the building that had finally solved the problem of putting people away.